Welcome to In Substantia, or rather welcome back. This is part 2 of my conversation with Gabor Holch on Europe's relationship with China. In part 1, we explored the layered history and cultural undercurrents from ancient trade routes to historical grievances to today's geopolitical maneuvers. We talked about infrastructure projects that reveal more than they deliver, alliances that shift under economic and political pressure, and the quiet ways culture shapes negotiation. In part 2, we pick up exactly where we left off. I had just raised one of the sharpest areas of strategic friction: technology. The Huawei controversy reshaped Europe's approach to 5G networks, and we raised the question of whether this was really about security or about Europe aligning with US policy and protecting Apple's position in China. This is where we begin the second part of our conversation, before moving to the bigger question of whether we're seeing the rise of a separate technological sphere and how Europe should respond. What you said, that the UK was thinking that the UK is smarter than China, is maybe a little bit of condescension, because China has always been very smart in the way they approach it. And they've been pretty aware of the necessity to become technically self-reliant. And ironically, because of the sanctions that were imposed, that seems to have accelerated their self-reliance in areas such as chip design and mobile operating system ecosystems. Are we watching the emergence of a fully separate tech sphere, and how should Europe respond?
Well, I don't think it's condescending at all. I think it's simply just everybody doing their jobs. So if you look at it, Huawei's job is to deliver the technological solutions that they want to deliver and to follow Chinese law. And if Chinese law says that since China is by far the biggest client of Huawei, they want to have a say in what and how is delivered to Europe, then yeah, that is part of the game. And let's say the British Secret Service saying it's not like we are smarter than you are, but we are saying like we are better spies than Huawei engineers, which is also understandable, if you see what I mean. So it's a little bit like, we know you're watching us, we watch you watch us. And which actually worked for thousands of years, if you think about it. You can also imagine somebody like Ren Zhengfei or somebody who is in the inner circles of Huawei. They just wanted to create. Why do you think Ren Zhengfei left the army, right? And he wanted to build a technology company. And then he looks back on his life right now. He's in the middle of a global political and national security uproar, which he certainly never asked for. His daughter was practically kidnapped at one point. Just imagine how he felt going through that. He is locked in this kind of power struggle. At least from what I can see, he's a genuinely nice guy, like many other of these allegedly diabolical global leaders. You can just see a human being locked down in uncontrollable forces, right? And then going forward from here, we can really imagine this like a company or like an institution, everybody doing their jobs, right? It is the guest service manager, let's say a hotel. It is the guest service manager's job to put up the Christmas tree or the Halloween decorations, but it's the safety manager's job to stop anything that would create a fire hazard or tipping hazard or endanger the building in any other way. And then there are really no good guys and bad guys here. As you can see, for example, if you take a company like BMW, right? So the German government starts talking about caution in terms of being dependent on China. And then the CEO of BMW is saying it's completely stupid. China is our most hopeful market. If you cannot sell German technology in China, where do you want to sell it? The same thing with NVIDIA and the United States. If you listen to those business people, they all propagate more engagement with China. But of course, we can also understand the generals and the national security people who have their own concerns. So it's just basically distribution of labor so to speak.
That economic layer is an important consideration. China is Europe's largest source of imports and a critical trading partner. Do you think that the current level of interdependence is sustainable, or are we heading for recalibration?
I think we are heading for a recalibration, but the two questions have very little to do with each other. So if the current level of interdependence is sustainable or not, that is a completely different question. You know, I am a Cold War child. If you remember back then, the Soviet Union and the so-called free world, you know, like the United States, Western Europe, and so on, they had very, very little interaction, economically speaking, and culturally speaking, and so on. So, you know, no Soviet party leaders send their kids to study at Harvard, like Chinese leaders do today. And there were you went to a big shopping center in London or New York, you couldn't find Soviet-made products. And there was very, very intimate collaboration, for example, in space. And then you look at it today, and it's completely the opposite. There is a huge ideological gap. There is intimate dependence, codependence in terms of economic terms, but China has its own space program. If we look at this, I think we are looking at the level of disengagement at the moment, but most of it comes out of a very rational and a very irrational consideration. The rational consideration is that it is arguable that during COVID, China did give in to the temptation to leverage its manufacturing capacity for political gain, right? So if you are not good to us, you may not get the masks, you may not get the gloves, you may not get the shipment of medical essentials. That caused genuine panic in Europe and the United States. The other one is just simple fear. Nobody can see the future. And they say, you know, if this is the way it goes, then we don't want to be dependent economically. Many corporate leaders, actually, what they are doing right now is they are, they are disengaging half as much or 1/3 as much as the public and the politicians think. They are making disengagement very, very visible so that they can tell politicians in Brussels or in Washington, you see, we are managing risks, and they are making engagement much more subtle so that they can also go to Beijing and tell Beijing, we are your friend. So these two things, they are going on at the same time. A lot of this responsibility will be up to China. Because if you look at, you asked me about two isolated technological spheres. I mean, the most isolated in terms of technology is China itself, right? So it has the Great Firewall, it has its own app ecosystem, it has its own data ecosystem, it has its own information ecosystem. There is very, very little exchange over there. Even Japan, which was a similar Galapagos island for a very long time, is much more integrated right now. And then, of course, technologically, that creates huge gaps. Like Chinese AI companies, they are in shortage of global data. They are trying to get it, but then they create suspicion, which is very important. But also there is an emotional element, because whatever is unknown is scary for human beings. And unfortunately, this is a big problem with China right now, is that it has nothing to do with China recently because of virtual work technology and the pandemic. Basically, just physical exchange, it went down. Tourism, business travel, everything, it took a hit, which means there is less access to China, less information about China. And what people don't know, they start suspecting. And this is what's happening to China. So China would need to work much harder, as China's own leadership says. They say, like, let's tell China's story well. They should be much more creative and much more open-minded about this, because there are amazing stories to tell about China, but those are not the stories that reach the world.
Could there be a positive interdependence? Europe may offer solutions to China's internal challenges. So could Europe reposition itself not just as a consumer market, but as a contributor to China's internal resilience, for example, in healthcare or elder care or education, especially as demographic pressures increase?
We have done it once. I mean, when China was admitted to the WTO, that's what happened for a decade, right? If you looked at it, if we go back mentally to the time when I started living in China, there was the maglev train to the Shanghai airport built by Siemens. There were entire hospitals equipped by GE Medical and lots of other companies. I mean, there you looked around. China basically sent state and party officials all over the world who memorized entire blueprints of how to manage taxes, how to run the healthcare system, how to run the education system. Some of it was copied from Canada. Some of it was copied from Japan. I was personally involved in an intellectual property protection project, which took blueprints from Brussels to Beijing. So this already happened with the best intentions, with a very open mindset. If we did it once, why couldn't we do it again? And now people like to think that we cannot work together for ideological reasons, right? Because, of course, I mean, Xi Jinping is much more hardcore in terms of Marxist-Leninist ideology than his predecessors were. But come on, if you look at it, the United States and Saudi Arabia have been cooperating with each other for decades, despite very, very fundamental ideological differences. So it can be done. We need to suspend certain judgment, and we need to learn certain ways to work together with each other. But it can be done. And especially in a continent, which I mean Europe right now, which is obsessed with diversity and plurality and how people from different ideological and identity backgrounds should collaborate in a constructive way. I think we definitely have the know-how to do this if we have the willingness.
Because I'm a mediator, I know the importance of having closure on past events. And I've been wondering how the past history is shaping some of the relations China has with the Occidental world. So China's century of humiliation, you can maybe contextualize that a little bit, still frames its diplomatic posture to some extent, I would imagine. China's diplomacy often invokes historical trauma, especially the century of humiliation I mentioned. Do you think these narratives are used more for domestic legitimacy or as tools in foreign policy?
I think it's more than that. I think there are certain narratives which basically make people panic and which open this kind of dark room in our collective psyche that we do not want to enter. We don't even want to knock on the door, so to speak. So if you look at it, and I will start from the Occidental side, as you said, you look at the issue with human rights violations in Xinjiang. Now, when I'm saying the issue of human rights violations in Xinjiang, I'm not talking about facts. I'm talking about the narrative. So that there are research institutions and media and individual people who say, obviously, something dodgy is going on in China. Now, what the Chinese decision makers have to understand is that immediately there is a very strong association in European minds with historical events during the Third Reich in Europe, right? So obviously, if I say to somebody, listen, there is a 50% chance that there are forced labor camps in China, right? Theoretically, it's 50-50. Somebody claims it, nobody has proven the opposite. And then you say, what do you think? Immediately in European minds, whether it's a prime minister or a taxi driver, the mental image that comes up is these black and white images from the Second World War, or actually after the Second World War, when this whole thing popped into the public consciousness. We cannot help it. On the gut level, this is such horror that it is able to stop meaningful conversation between the two sides, right? And to some extent, China understands this because China has the comparable story about Japanese occupation, which is equally black and white, equally shocking, and equally how do you say, offensive if there is a parallel between the two. So then suddenly the conversation stops because both sides deal with a kind of historical trauma that is very difficult to discuss. Now, I said difficult, not impossible, because as a mediator, you know exactly, and you know practitioners like William Ury, or I can go back to my past when I was working for the OSCE in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I literally sat between warring parties to start a conversation, and it's possible. It's hard work, but for mutual benefit, it's possible. The center of humiliation in China is a slightly different story, because you are not going to meet anybody in the streets of Beijing who's been there, right? I mean, my grandparents lived through the Second World War. Nobody who is alive today lived through the Opium Wars. So if we want to follow the logic of Yuval Harari, it's a myth. It's a myth in the sense of we pass it down. It's a story that we pass down from one generation to another. And there are very many questionable elements of this. We talked about this when we had this chat in preparation here in my Budapest office, is that, like, for example, at the same time as the Opium Wars were going on, and they claimed tens of thousands of lives, and they involved armies of thousands of people. At the same time, in China, there was a so-called Taiping Revolution, which was a civil war. So it was a Chinese war, which involved millions of soldiers and tens of millions of fatalities. So obviously, I perfectly understand why the leadership of China would sharpen the narrative on the Opium Wars and not the Taiping Wars. If we lived in an alternative universe and the biggest threat to China would be civil war, and that civil war tears the country apart, then the Taiping Revolution would be at the top of the narrative. But it's more instrumental right now if there is this sense of shame towards the rest of the world because of the 100 years of humiliation. And then obviously, if you look at the West, we really don't know how to deal with this in the West. These nations which are not predominantly or not entirely white anymore, so to speak. Minorities have tangible rights in these. One of my friends told me the other day, there is this family who is like a third generation Pakistani family in Germany or in the UK. Why would they have to feel guilty for being British or German? The nations itself, they changed entirely. Is there collective responsibility here to something that happened at least like 100 years ago or more than 100 years ago? And what would be the right attitude? Because on one hand, China is pushing this narrative, but on the other hand, China is not a tiny nation who would want some reparation and the return of some artifacts, and that would settle it, right? So Europe, on one hand, doesn't know how to approach this. On the other hand, is like, what does China really want?
During the preparatory conversation that we had in your office, I suggested that symbolic apologies from former colonial powers might help reset the relationship, but you raised strong objections. Could you explain why that kind of gesture might not have the intended effect in a Chinese context?
Well, I mean, let's start with the fact that China has never been a colony. So obviously, in the sense of this anti-colonial, so the whole anti-colonial direction of Marxist-Leninist ideology, it was born in Europe. Nations that were oppressed, Marx already wrote about this. Mao Zedong himself also commented on this. If you read the original writing of Mao, it's not such an easy story, right? Because the West is a source of oppression, but the West is also a source of industrialization. The West oppresses traditional culture from places like China, but so does the party. So Mao himself says, the idea here is not to preserve the Chinese traditions, is to replace them with something more modern, because Mao himself was a modernizer. China was never a colony, so wait a minute, why would we apologize for something which was basically done through treaties? Of course, we know that these treaties were forced at the barrel of the gun, but so were every other treaty in the 19th century. Right? So while there were much more tragic incidents happening in the 19th century between East and West, and even between Asian nations, which were much bloodier than the Opium Wars. So actually, if you look back, this is a very interesting area of within the 20th century, which started off for China as the Qing dynasty, and then a Republic of China, which went through at least 3 big stages of national identity. Immediately after the collapse of the empire with Sun Chongshan, Sun Yat-sen, and then civil war, and then Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Kai-shek, and then the People's Republic of China. People write PhDs about in which stage did China sign international agreements, and when eventually China became People's Republic, how they picked and choose which ones of these are valid and which ones are not. And this still, it still keeps changing. So Europe is in a little bit of a, okay, we can apologize for something we as a nation didn't really do, right? Also, this could start a very interesting chain reaction of apologies. For example, should Hungary demand an apology from Turkey for the same reasons? Should Turkey demand an apology from Egypt? Should Japan demand an apology from Holland, from the Netherlands? Because there were also some territorial wars over there. So
I wasn't suggesting that we have to respond to a request from China for an
right.
But that would be a spontaneous one to start conversations. But you said
you asked me about my reservations, and yes. this is so. If I am not in a diplomatic position anymore, actually, I'm partially glad that I'm not. But if I were involved in this discussion in a professional fashion, I would always advise caution. How far do we go back, and how easily we identify certain identities as continuous, as national identity. So we shouldn't forget, China is an ancient culture, but it's a very young nation, right? So it's like if there is somebody in the world right now who's in their early 80s, People's Republic of China, the state of China is younger than that person.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That is extremely important. So if we go back to the Versailles treaties, if we go back to the end of the Second World War, let's say, when there was just a very good book published about a Marine, a US Marine who was stationed in China during and after the Second World War. If we go back to those times, if we go back to the Opium Wars, we have to ask some extremely serious questions about the identity, the continuity of the institutions and the nations who are in question. And it becomes much less simple who is supposed to apologize to whom, and who's supposed to feel guilty. So I know that in Confucian tradition, guilt is viewed in a completely different way. In Confucian tradition, guilt is viewed as a source of personal growth, basically, as a very strong force for the good of the individual and the collective, right? But then if you look at it from the perspective of the UK, which already lost its empire, right? Some people in the UK would say, don't you think that's like bad enough to start with? Are we supposed to apologize for something which we already don't have? If you look at it from Italy was part of the occupying forces in China. Is Italy supposed to feel guilty about the 100 years of humiliation against China? Not to mention that then there are serious reservations about treatment of the Chinese population by Chinese authorities themselves during and after the time that we cause. So in Dragon Suit, in my book about foreign executives in China, I wrote the humiliation didn't necessarily end when the foreigners left, the foreign armies left China, but that wasn't happily ever after for the general Chinese population. The worst was just coming, right? The civil wars between imperial forces and Republican forces fighting with each other, Republican forces and Communist Party, then Cultural Revolution, then Great Leap Forward, whatever you want. So it is not a black and white story, and therefore I do not think that this is a constructive way forwards for China's international relations with the rest of the world. China would basically, just like any other big country, could easily have a beef with anybody close by.
Mhm. I wanted to take the focus now on media narratives and public misperception. Media narratives often oversimplify the other's complexity. The European media often presents China as an authoritarian monolith. Chinese media depicts Europe as declining and subordinate to the United States. How much damage do these caricatures cause at the diplomatic level, or maybe even at the business level?
Well, I would first advise anybody to read the press or watch the press with caution anywhere in the world, right? Because the press is an institution with its own agenda. You have to know this. I mean, interestingly, people accept this from universities, from governments, from the tax bureau, from corporations, but somehow they expect the media to be the mouth of truth. I don't know why. I think sometimes it's a very easy psychological strawman. It's a little bit like a fairy tale that we tell each other, and then if it doesn't happen that way, then we have the justification to be angry and feel good about ourselves. Sometimes we are definitely cheated, right? So in countries with a more authoritarian leaning, then obviously you cannot believe what you read in the newspapers. But people who grew up in Hungary, people who grew up in China, in Vietnam, in Cuba, in Russia, they already know this. You read between the lines in school textbooks and media as well. In democratic countries or in capitalistically minded societies, then of course it's a different kind of bias. They sell you commercial, they sell you whatever their stakeholders want the readers to know. So I don't know why people are so shocked that the media is biased. And then you have to look at what kind of narrative these media institutions promise to their readers, right? So when I was little and when we lived in Iraq and where we lived in Hungary, then of course it was always a kind of good and evil kind of thing. America was the big Satan, as they called them in the Middle East. And whatever happened, you had to prove that the Americans are evil. In Hungary, that the party will protect you. I mean, it's out there. It's a big mess. I remember I found this kind of notebook where I doodled, where I made sketches when I was about 10 years old. And I remember I was really shocked because as a Hungarian kid of 10 years old, I drew bread lines in Liverpool, like poor people queuing for bread in Liverpool.
Okay.
Where did I get this idea? What comes from China, and I think I already touched upon this, I do believe it's China's responsibility to a very, very high degree. Because listen, just pick up anybody from anywhere. As every citizen who's interested in China, in living in Serbia or in France or in Japan or in South Africa, where are they supposed to get direct, reliable information? Social media is blocked, so Chinese citizens are not on global social media. Exceptions like Xiaoshu and TikTok sometimes work, sometimes connect people, sometimes don't. Nobody watches Chinese television channels outside of China the way you watch Al Jazeera or CNN or Deutsche Welle from Germany, right? China is far away. It's not one of the biggest tourist destinations in the world. More people visit the Eiffel Tower in a year than the People's Republic of China. Where is the information supposed to come? This is why I said this kind of promise to tell China's stories well. I think Chinese decision makers should work much, much harder to tell the stories that now they keep fairly close to their chest. It's not the media's job to set you straight. It's not the media's job to provide you with a balanced, reliable worldview. It's your responsibility. If you think the media is skewed, do research. You are sitting in front of the internet hours and hours every day. instead of downloading the 10th recipe to bake pumpkin or watch funny videos of people falling flat on their faces while they are skipping the rope, try to do a little bit of research, try to correct the, the faults of the evil media.
To some extent, it boils down to interpersonal relationships when you're in talks or negotiations. In your experience, have you witnessed moments where mutual misunderstanding rather than policy differences created avoidable tension or mistrust?
And that's my job. Yeah, of course. Policy is easy to get away from. I mean, it's the overwhelming majority of people, they want to get away from politics because it's depressing. It is difficult to understand. There is too much power. Most people in the world are not power hungry. You know, they want joy. They want money. They want rest. They want sunshine, or sometimes they want rain if they have the reason. But most people don't want power the way politicians want power. So our gut reaction is to get away from politics. But then comes the interesting stuff. Let me just take a couple of examples. One of my good friends is a museum manager, right? And then he was sent on a conference to Asia to meet other museum managers. And museum management, you would think it's a fairly easy topic to talk about. But then people build trust between each other in a different way, and people dress in a different way, and people eat different food, and people interpret it differently. If somebody is talking to you for 5 minutes and then the other side just keeps silent for half a minute, or laughs at something, or displays certain kind of body language. And the human brain decides so quickly about the other human being. And it's so difficult to reverse these kind of unconscious decisions that I think this is where the real stuff is, so to speak. So I am just working on a slide deck for a speech that I'm going to deliver in Switzerland. And then the whole point is that when I work with executives or diplomats from Europe to work in China, Japan, Southeast Asia, then usually they go into the preparation process with these big strategic ideas they think the intercultural challenge is going to be to deploy the competency model of the company in a different culture. But no, it's not going to be that. The challenge is going to be how to keep your balance when suddenly your diet and the temperature changes dramatically. How you can make your assistant and general manager and client do what you want them to do using human communication, which is very communication, like culture dependent, right? When you raise your voice, when you ask a question, when you are going to be misunderstood. These are very, very simple things. What will happen to you if you step into a meeting room and you dressed in a way which is inappropriate in a given culture? And then when you discover that it's inappropriate, which 80% of the time you won't, by the way, but let's say you do, then how do you counterbalance it with the right culturally agile behavior, right? So these are I can tell you examples if you want to. You enter a meeting room, right? Just imagine you enter a meeting room. There are 8 chairs around a long table. There, it's like 3 on each side and 1 in front and 1 at the back. Where do you sit down? It's empty. You're 5 minutes early. Do you sit down? Where do you sit down? Where are they going to sit? Then everybody sat down. Let's say you sat down at the head of the table. They look at you at a weird way. Who's going to speak first? What are they going to say? Right? By the time you're 5 minutes into a meeting, you are deep, deep, deep into cultural nuances. This is my job. I coach and advise people one-on-one. Somebody who is preparing for an important set of negotiations in a different continent, somebody who just got promoted and has like 3 virtual teams in 3 different Asian countries, or I train management teams with a very project-specific approach to these kind of challenges.
Diplomacy operates on different logics. You in China go about it very differently, I think. So I seem to understand that European diplomacy tends to emphasize parity, dialogue, and institutional balance. And Chinese diplomacy, you correct me if I'm wrong, often assumes an asymmetrical approach and respects hierarchy. Can these worldviews ever reconcile in practice?
Yes, absolutely. Because what you said, parity, dialogue, and institutional balance. If you went back to Beijing and talked to a Chinese diplomat, he would probably say, no, no, that's exactly what we want as well. The problem is that we interpret these words differently, depending on culture, right? What is parity? So it is like the Slovenian prime minister and the Chinese prime minister, is that parity? One side might have a different idea than the other side about that. Dialogue, what does dialogue mean, right? In certain Asian cultures, dialogue is much quieter than in certain European cultures. Extroverted cultures, ones that are emotionally expressive in the way of intercultural guru Erin Meyer, we have the tendency to not to tolerate silence. So if we start a dialogue, so to speak, and either on the personal level or institutional level, there is quiet, there is silence, then a relatively extroverted culture's gut reaction is to keep talking. Even when we are tired of our own voice, we just keep going and we are wondering, why don't they say anything? Right? And then you go over to the Chinese side and it's like, why do they keep talking? Why don't they give us our turn? So this inverted commas dialogue has different rules on the two sides. And then let's say parity plus dialogue. Now you already created an amazing world of, let's say we have the parity on this level. So how is the dialogue supposed to go? Right? So there are different rules of a dialogue with parity. For example, do you jump right into the matter of the business? Or do you use words to build trust and intimacy at the beginning? The interesting thing is that, let's say, if you talk to the Chinese side who try to build up some trust and intimacy by what we experience as small talk, but that's not what they think it is, right? Then you lose the parity and the intimacy at the beginning. Because the Dutch side or the Russian side or the Italian side, well, are these really serious business people? Are we just going to talk about food for how long? Are they professional? Did they send us the right people? And this is the interesting dynamic, not whether we want parity or dialogue, everybody does, but how you interpret parity and dialogue.
So as a coach, the building of bridges is your bread and butter. What cultural or institutional innovations are you suggesting could help bridge this gap? For instance, hybrid diplomacy models, long-term trust building frameworks, or cross-cultural advisory mechanisms?
In this respect, I'm not entirely different from a legal counsel or an architect. So from the outside, it looks like you're making up stuff. It's like it's all in your head, and then you give or you suggest responses to certain situations that the other side doesn't know where it comes from. But actually, you have these kind of patterns in your mind, and some of them even have a name, right? So if you're a lawyer and your client wants to invest or divest, or they want to scale up, or they want to register a new entity, you have names for the different ways to approach this. And intercultural leadership coaches, that's exactly the same thing. So for example, on a let's say a personal level, on the communication level, there are certain rhetorical techniques that can make sure that you are not sitting in silence, because two listeners don't make a good conversation, which is something that you can experience if two listening cultures meet each other. But you are also not just keep talking until you're really tired of your voice. So there are certain, we teach and then practice these techniques at workshops, and at coaching, we help people reach certain one in their own style of, for example, questioning techniques. Like when do you ask a question? A question is a very nice middle way between not saying anything and dominating the conversation. Because if you're relatively communication-wise, a relative extrovert, you will not be a good listener. If you just decide not to speak, then you keep focusing inward and the other one speaks and speaks and speaks, and you will keep thinking about what you want to say next, especially if you disagree with what you hear. But what you can do is open your mouth, get rid of this energy, vent, but the form, the grammatical form is a question. So you immediately hand the locus of control of communication back to the other side. So if the other side is a relatively introverted communicator, just doesn't have to sit there and listen to you. They need a little bit of nudge to share with you. So you can almost engineer a conversation. If you go on a higher level, for example, the parity, right? It's good to learn a little bit about the structure, the institutional structure of the other culture. What does parity mean in this case? Because there are cultures who really don't care too much about the internal hierarchy of as long as the collaboration works, right? So I remember, for example, Israel is one of the most egalitarian societies in the world. And that sounds very abstract. But I remember when I was a young man, I was still a graduate student, and my side business was I was an interpreter at business trips for high-level executives. That's why I got my first glimpses into it. And we went to a large company in Israel, and we were supposed to meet the CEO. And then we went to the factory floor, and the CEO climbed out from underneath a machine. He was like on one of these rolling platforms that you use when you want to go underneath, and he put like an overall over his business suit, which is very unlikely to happen in China or even in Britain, in my opinion. But he was like, I'm just one of the guys. His background was engineering, so you learn a little bit about which are the mistakes that they will really take seriously and which are the mistakes that you shouldn't worry that much about. It's not, if you have the kind of system to compare cultures, like we use culture maps, then it's not as complicated as it sounds.
Let's pivot to the climate agenda. Some argue it's one of the last viable areas of cooperation. Climate change is often cited as the one area where EU-China cooperation remains viable. Do you see real opportunities here, or is it mostly rhetorical?
No, it's very far from mostly rhetorical. I think it's one of those areas where we tend to focus on the challenges and forget about what we have done already. This is partially because poor climate change practitioners, whatever they do, it turns into so-called competition. All right? So again, when I made that speech in 2008 for the China Renewable Energy Association, then the big goal was to use China's manufacturing prowess to provide the European Union with cheap and acceptable quality renewable energy technology. The solar panels that we need, the wind turbines that we need. That's when China started manufacturing these things on larger scale. Then they did. Without that, Europe itself could not have manufactured the amount of equipment that we needed to meet the EU's own climate targets, right? China delivered. What did it become? A narrative of China killing the European renewable energy industry, and somehow, again, trying to control the world with taking over all these sectors which are essential for the future. And we also tend to forget about the institutional cooperation that took place, how China became an essential part of United Nations institutions that regulate climate cooperation, how China itself cleaned up its own act, right? If I look at this mobile phone in my hand right now, and I open the air quality app that every single person who ever lived in China downloaded, at least one or two of them, and I'm looking at the global picture, it's not China anymore that's going to going to host the most polluted cities in the world. At the moment, Delhi usually pops up at the top of that list, right? World
In
Health
Chiang Mai,
Organization.
yes.
Yeah, exactly. So WHO says, over world standard 50 PMI, don't do sports outside. If it's more than 100, try not to go outside. In Shanghai, we easily had 600s, 700s 10 years ago. And now we don't. So it is something just, human beings have a tendency to, when they check the box, then they forget about the box, and then they focus on the boxes that are unchecked at the moment. And even we can add more. Is the world going to adopt China's fast train technology? It would be really good for the carbon footprint of mass transportation. Let's see. Electric vehicles. Is it really the way forward? Let's see. Are we going to use Chinese technology or European technology or something else? Let's see. But I think a lot has been done already. We are in a better position right now. Politics is another issue. But in terms of technology, financing, institutional cooperation, we have done a lot.
And beyond climate, might soft power domains offer more traction than trade or tech? Could collaboration around aging societies, sustainable cities, or cultural exchange provide more traction for Europe-China relations than trade or tech negotiations alone?
I think what is going to happen is exactly this kind of picture that I shared with you. I think politicians will keep trying to make us heed caution. They are going to focus on the dangers of global integration, and business people, they are going to keep trying to do their jobs, because even if it's geopolitically dangerous, we will need flip-flops and electric cars and solar panels and electric cars in one place, and financial services and precision machines and know-how and luxury goods in the other market. We will need, so you can stop this only by political means. Like Vladimir Putin said, no French cheese and ham in Russia. You can do that. You can also say in China, no global social media in China. You can do that. You can clamp down on these things. But what immediately happens is global commerce, the people-to-people exchange in business, is one of the oldest and most agile forces in the world, right? If you look at the kind of logbooks that archaeologists use to read or to learn to read ancient Sumerian texts, if you have an accounting degree, you know what they are doing there. So commerce and business and idea exchange, it will find its way over, under, through these barriers. And I think that's a good thing, right? So ASML gets the word from Washington, you are not supposed to sell your best technology to China. Okay, they are going to comply with laws. They are going to do what they must do as their duty, as Holland being a NATO nation. And then they will start to say, okay, how do we still deliver the promise to our clients? This is perfectly normal. And I think this is going on. I am involved in many of these initiatives. So if you look at it, smart cities in China, very, very necessary, because if large Chinese cities use the blueprint of development that American and European cities used, then we are all screwed environmental-wise. We need a completely different model. We need those smart cities. We need environmentally more sustainable models. China is just one nation. I know some people don't think it like that, but China is just one nation. They cannot be smarter than the rest of the world combined. So they need international cooperation to come up with that blueprint. And then Europe is involved. I'm personally involved in some projects that Europe provides know-how for these smart cities. And then the Middle East, which has the funding, which has the playground, so to speak, that you can generate a lot of solar energy, you have a lot of space, you have a lot of local need. You can use Middle Eastern countries as a lab to experiment with next generation technologies the way you cannot anymore in China, right? Because there is an instant need of end user technology. There is not so much space in China for experimentation as there was 10 years ago. And these people, they are compliant with laws, they are respectful of the national interest of their countries, but they keep doing their jobs.
If you were to forecast the state of EU-China relations 10 years from now, what are the most plausible scenarios? Are we heading towards deeper engagement or more hardened spheres of influence?
I think we are over the honeymoon period of the post WTO accession when we really believe that all of these communism, shamanism, that we will overcome if we can make trains and hospitals and telephones together. So we found out that it's a little bit deeper than that. We have to go forward with a little bit more caution than that. But also, the European Union is not so politically capricious as the United States is, right? So there is not the one room in one house has a new resident. It's not going to change everything about how everything goes forward in the EU. The EU, just like China, has some fairly tangible long-term plans, and I think they are easier to coordinate with each other. So if I looked into the future, my guess would be that there are certain areas in the European Union where actually the situation is going to be very similar to what China has been doing so far. So we want to be integrated, we want to cooperate, but not in national defense, not in energy, not in the financial system. We will be very cautious about integrating the mass communication system, the data security system, and so on. So I think actually the EU is going to borrow certain pages from China's playbook. Okay, let's play it this way. But then there is going to be plenty of space left for solving issues like long-term sustainable energy, transportation, education is suffering right now. It's a very important area. I think we will figure out sooner or later how we can work together. It's the tragedy that's happening to Chinese students in the United States right now. It's to be avoided on both sides. And what we will see is there was a huge upward curve in the early 2000s when I lived in China. It was lots of fun. This curve is going to descend, but cooperation is going to continue. And I'm watching out for certain news items. So, for example, Chinese and European space programs starting to actively cooperate with each other. I'm going to have a drink then, because that would be an excellent sign. Then not looking at electric vehicle markets as a zero-sum competition, but saying one of the big German car companies and BYD saying, why don't we develop something specifically for the European, Middle East, and North African market that could be like a Chinese German Tesla? Then I would, want to hug somebody.
So if you could offer one piece of advice, and it's not a supposition because you told us that you're in a position to do so. So to policymakers and to Chinese leadership, I suppose those would be different pieces of advice. What would you urge each side to prioritize for building a more stable and intelligent relationship?
You mean what professional areas?
No, if you could offer pieces of advice to European policymakers and to Chinese leadership, what
Very
would you
simple.
urge each time?
Yeah. One of the reasons why I was so interested in China and Japan is that I've been doing martial arts since I was a kid, and this is what wise self-defense instructors would tell you, and I think in diplomacy it works as well. When you're scared of somebody, walk as close as you can while feeling safe still, and start asking personal questions, right? And I think it works. It always works, because we just assume evil intention very often because what the other person does or the way they look, it means evil in our own culture, right? Mm-hmm. It's a little bit now in China, in Chinese official media, there is this meme that people who wear a lot of tattoos are criminals, right? But then if you go to Holland, you come to Eastern Europe, this is blatantly untrue. It's a kind of millennial and Gen Z the habit to tattoo all kinds of actually quite hippie-ish things on yourself. So you don't have to be stupid. You don't have to get in range if you think somebody might be scary. But you can ask them. I don't know if somebody watches my YouTube channel, but I had an interview with Sherry Lobau, who is an American consultant in Saudi Arabia. And then she told me this story when she walked into somebody's property, open, not a building, but walked into somebody's property in Saudi Arabia to feed a cat, a stray cat. And then the proprietor, the owner, came over, and then she became quite scared because she thought she might be in violation of the property. And then she describes in a YouTube interview, she describes the conversation that ensued and how well it ended, right? So somebody is being American, she said, in the US, they might shoot at you if you walked into somebody's property like that. So don't shoot, somebody is there, somebody looks scary, they wear a Communist Party pin, or they say something that triggers you. We were talking about these unfortunate historical incidents. Walk close enough, smile, say, listen, when people do that or say that in your culture, what does it mean? Right? A very, very good question is like, what do you wish I did right now? You are a mediator, you know that even hostage negotiators use
typical mediation.
Yeah, exactly. You see that person behaves in a weird way, and it's like, well, what does he want from me? And turn the rhetorical question into a real question. So what would be a great move from me right now that would make you say, wow, now we are making progress? Ask these questions. Again, questions are the perfect middle way between not engaging in dialogue and dominating the dialogue. I think that's the best advice I can give.
Well, thank you. It's been really interesting to talk about these issues. Maybe we can talk again in the future and see how things evolve. I like to end my conversations with one question. What is it that we're not talking about, but we should be?
You mean us, the two Gabors, or generally people
not as
in
the two
East-West
Gabors.
relations?
We can do that afterwards on some other occasion, but in general, in relation to Europe or the Occident's relation to China and China's relation to the world, more about in line with the topic that we've been covering.
What we share. We don't talk enough about what we share. So we don't in two different meanings to this expression. So one of them is that, I knew some people who were working on excavations of the Bingmayong, the Xi'an Koto warriors. And then there is always this kind of suspicion that there were non-Chinese people among those soldiers and builders, human remains that they find. But it's impossible to tell, right? There are these kind of legends that they brought in people from Europe or Central Asia. There were all kinds of foreigners among the people who built and manned, because this was originally a grave. But archaeologists just examine those skeletons for decades, and they cannot tell if it was a Chinese person or a Western person. How cool is that? We are the same people. There is practically no difference. When the way we look and when we dress up and we have a haircut, then we have different habits. But genetically speaking, there is absolutely no difference. I think that's very, very cool. This is one thing. The other thing that we share is that what keeps us together. Like, I love these stories about porcelain and tea, and how certain habits moved between East and West over the centuries. And I think if we just talked about these kind of things, then we would be much better off with each other, right? And this is why when you are in a foreign land and somebody wants to build a relationship with you, they usually invite you for a meal, right? There are exceptions, but this is international. There are two things that always work across cultures. One of them is a smile. The other one is a meal. And this is why, for example, if you go to a foreign country and you learn from locals how to cook a national dish, this is something that stays with you for the rest of your life. So really, when you feel the other side is weird or scary or anything like this, I would encourage you to just do this. Like any kind of culture that you feel weird, go below the surface and then ask them about something. Ask them about their kids. Ask them about how they bake bread or make a stew in their culture, or try to do something together. So I think this is the people to people relation. Then if you go to the high level, you get abstract and you start talking about religion and politics and things like this, everybody gets scary.
It's a very wise answer. And as a mediator, I can only concur. Thank you very much, Gabor. It's been a really interesting conversation. And thank you for your time. So we can see right behind you the title of your book, Dragon Suit.
Right.
I'll put a link into the podcast so that people can find it easily. And are there other publications that you'd like to mention?
Dragon Suit is my latest book, and it's very relevant here because it was based on interviews with international executives in China. So I would definitely recommend it. Some of my books are in Hungarian. I also have a book about East-West relations, which is also on Amazon. It's easy to find, but it's more academic, so I will leave it up to our listeners. But otherwise, if you want to reach out to me, either find my full name in the show notes, or you check Dragon Suit Book, not just Dragon Suit. Please search for Dragon Suit Book. If you just search Dragon Suit, you will get a lot of Halloween costumes for kids, funny dragon suits. Or East-West Leadership, which is the name of my business, and one way or another, you will definitely get to me and drop me a line. You know, I would love to engage in conversation with people who are listening.
And your YouTube channel.
My YouTube channel as well. You will get all of this if you Google my full name. You will very easily get to me because there are many Holches in the world and many Gabors, but there is only one Gabor Holch.
Okay, so I'll put the link in the show notes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the conversation.